Well, before I turn to my prepared remarks, I just am overcome really with gratitude for the opportunity to be here, and I want to thank everyone who made that possible. It's also wonderful to see so many old friends, judges and people who work in the criminal justice system. Even though I'm kind of outside the tent now, it's great to see people who are still in it and feel the connection that I think we still have. And I will say Rabbi Lipsker set the stage beautifully for this entire conference, and he also anticipated some of the things I'm going to talk about. So I don't want to in any way be redundant. He was so eloquent. But I think you'll recognize some similar themes. Thank you, Judge Aiken. 42 years ago, as an impressionable teenager, I arrived on the campus of Stanford University to begin my college education. During new student orientation, we were encouraged to look for interesting elective courses to add to our required first-year curriculum. With no idea of the impact it would come to have on my life, I decided to take a class called Contemporary Trends in Religious Thought. The course surveyed the dramatic changes then occurring in many of the world's great faith traditions. We studied the transformations within the Catholic Church as a result of the Vatican Council, the impact of secular existentialism on Jewish and Protestant theology, and the increasing influence of Eastern religious practice in the Western world. One of the modern Jewish theologians we studied was Martin Buber. Reading Buber's best-known work, I and Thou, I felt as though something profoundly true about the world, something I felt deeply, yet never had been able to articulate, was being revealed to me. This remarkable experience in the first few weeks of my freshman year kindled a lifelong interest in religious studies, an interest that continued even after I decided to become a lawyer and has provided an invaluable reference point throughout my life, including my subsequent career as a judge. I've never ceased to be curious about what matters most to people, what makes them go, what they rely upon to guide the course of their lives. Although Buber departed in significant ways from traditional Judaism, the core concept in I and Thou, and much of his other work, is one that has animated Jewish thought for centuries. And that is that there is a divine spark within every human being, a spark that is present in every genuine connection between people. Reflecting the common origins of Judaism and Christianity, Pope Francis has referred to this same concept in his efforts to promote greater inclusion in the Catholic Church. When I first heard about the Aleph Institute and its commitment to transforming the way we think about criminal justice, particularly our approach to incarceration, it was deeply reassuring to encounter the divine spark again. It is a concept that affects not only the way we see people, but also how we relate with them. A truly transformative approach to criminal justice requires not only an abstract respect for every person, but also a genuine openness to meeting each person where he or she is and experiencing our common humanity. Any real transformation also requires a realistic understanding of what it is one is seeking to transform. Prior to leaving the bench last September, I served for 37 years as a state and federal trial judge. I presided over thousands of criminal cases and sentenced hundreds of people to prison, some for a very long time. For most of my judicial career, I had regular and frequent contact with crime victims, police officers, prosecutors, defense lawyers, and criminal defendants. I heard testimony about and saw physical evidence of the worst kinds of human behavior. Sometimes that behavior caused direct harm to innocent victims, and sometimes the most lasting harm was to the defendant, him or herself. When people were given the opportunity to make restitution to their victims or deal with the addiction or other life issues that underlay their criminal conduct, most of them failed. I remember one year as a state court judge when my assignment was to resolve as many felony cases as possible by settlement. I'm from California, and judicial settlement of criminal cases is a standard practice there. I had previous experience as a mediator, and I always have tended to be relatively successful at bringing people together. Every week, I settled several dozen cases, with the defendants pleading guilty in exchange for an agreed amount of time in jail or prison. At first, I felt satisfaction at being good at my job and lightening the burden on my colleagues. But as the year went on, I noticed that I was feeling increasingly cynical, that my view of human nature was being degraded by my constant exposure to the worst in people. It's not as though my next assignment, handling will contests and other familial disputes as head of the probate division, was particularly uplifting. But there was something unrelentingly discouraging about that year. As part of another criminal assignment, I was responsible for calendars consisting of nothing but hearings on alleged violations of conditions of probation or other court-imposed obligations. Typically, convicted offenders were accused of having dirty drug tests, failing to pay fines, fees, or restitution, committing new offenses, or failing to report to their probation officer. The allegations almost always were true, and the explanations, when they were offered, were depressingly similar and unconvincing. Not infrequently, offenders wouldn't even make it to their hearings, even though they had been told repeatedly that failure to appear could result in their being returned to custody. I think about what it must be like seeing this reality, not just for 1 year, but for many years. I think about seeing it not from the privileged, removed position of a judge, but from the unfiltered view of a police officer, criminal investigator, a probation or parole officer, or a prison guard, many of whom work in substandard conditions with insufficient resources. I think about being the victim of a serious life-altering crime, or the family member of someone who has repeatedly failed to live a responsible and law-abiding life. It can be difficult, if not impossible, for someone in such circumstances to be hopeful, to see anything other than punishment as an effective and appropriate response. It is difficult, if not impossible, under such circumstances, to think or care about what got the defender to where he or she is, to see his or her humanity as anything other than an abstraction. It is all too easy to become numb and indifferent to the human trauma one sees every day. We build prisons and incarcerate people because so many people see the alternatives as naive and unrealistic. I think we have to acknowledge that some of our past efforts to create alternatives have been naive and unrealistic. We've talked about the humanity of criminal offenders without comprehending how deeply so many of them have been hurt, and how relentlessly that hurt expresses itself in a feeling of victimization or in antisocial or self-destructive actions, often irrespective of the severity of the consequences. We've given people second, third, and fourth chances without really thinking about and providing the kind of material and social support they need to be able to benefit from those chances. We don't like the fact that so many people are incarcerated, but we haven't always engaged at a holistic emotional level with what breaking the cycle of recidivism actually will require. In focusing on the injustices of our legal system and our society generally, we haven't always acknowledged the profound suffering of victims of crime, often including the families and loved ones of the offenders themselves. And unfortunately, when well-intentioned but flawed efforts have failed to reduce crime or improve public safety, often there has been a political reaction that has led to even more prisons and even longer sentences. I am not saying any of this to put a damper on why we are here today. To the contrary, I wouldn't be here today if I didn't believe that the work of this symposium has great promise and a real chance of success. I note only that, as I suggested a minute ago, truly transformative actions require firm rooting in reality. As everyone here knows, the reality we hope to transform presents a formidable challenge. Before I became a judge, I represented people with chronic or severe mental illnesses in their interactions with the legal system. Like their criminal justice system counterparts, many of our clients had been released from institutional confinement without a lot of thought having been given to what they might need in the community. Many of our clients were unable to express themselves effectively. They suffered from delusional thinking or were prone to outbursts of extreme and uncontrolled emotion. And more often than not, these issues showed themselves in ways that scared people away and made it particularly hard to help them. My ethical obligation as a lawyer required me to advocate for what my clients told me they wanted rather than what I thought they ought to want. But I couldn't accomplish much by advocating for impossible outcomes. I had to get to know my clients, spend time with them, listen to them, and through the long, slow process of building a relationship, give them space to tell me what was going on in their lives. More often than not, there was something, their living situation, their health care, their public benefits, their personal relationships, that was making their already difficult circumstances more difficult. And sometimes by helping them to address those life issues, we could also move the needle on their longer-term situation. A small number of our clients even were able to join our staff as advocates themselves. Judges who sentence people to prison often hope that the people they sentence will use their time in custody to reflect on their mistakes and not repeat the behavior that got them there. This does happen from time to time. There are people who, for whatever reason, decide that enough is enough and mobilize themselves to live a productive life. But for most people in prison, this is a bridge too far. As Rabbi Lipsker so eloquently described it, the prison culture is dehumanizing. And life in the community after release typically is fraught with the same problems and dysfunctions that were there before. For many, the obligations of excessive fines and fees frequently create an additional obstacle. With few exceptions, people who have spent time in prison are most likely to succeed outside only if they can find a deeper place within themselves, only if they can see themselves and the people around them in a different way. They need to gain or regain a sense of their intrinsic worth, not as a vague idea, but as a physical and spiritual reality. Usually they need to recognize and process emotionally the ways that they have hurt themselves and hurt others, and take responsibility for making things right. And they need people to support them, people who will listen to them, encourage them, be honest with them, assist them in finding work and a healthy place to live, help them stay clean and sober and out of trouble. In recent years, a growing number of state and federal courts have implemented reentry programs and other alternatives to incarceration. These are worthy efforts, and some of them have produced remarkable and encouraging success stories. We will be hearing some of those stories here. Yet others have not, While some individual offenders have benefited, recidivism rates for participants in some programs have remained unchanged, leading the court leaders in those courts to conclude that those programs aren't worth the additional investment of time and money. I don't think the explanation for these mixed results is hard to find. Some court-based programs are based on a model of intensive supervision, which in turn is based on the assumption that bringing an offender before a judicial officer every few weeks will provide an offender with motivation to avoid further trouble with the law. There's evidence that this approach can work if an offender already is motivated and if the judicial officer is able to communicate an uncommon degree of empathy and caring. But there's also evidence that many offenders simply don't want that much formal oversight. Instead, what they want and need is a type of social support that court-based programs often lack the resources to provide. Like the clients of our mental health advocacy program, most people coming out of prison need help navigating the basic requirements of life outside. Finding a safe and adequate place to live. Finding work or job training that offers an alternative to crime. Getting health care, treatment for chemical dependency, and other available benefits. They also need help dealing with the challenges of building positive relationships and avoiding the toxic entanglements of the past. There's evidence that this social work model, as distinguished from intensive supervision standing alone, does reduce recidivism more broadly. It does so because its essential purpose is transformative rather than managerial. The objective isn't just to keep an offender out of trouble, it's to help the offender change the reality of his or her life. Of course, one of the inconvenient truths about our criminal justice system and our society generally is that making a social work model work requires not only a proper framing of what we're trying to do, but also a serious commitment of both economic and human capital. It's not enough just to see the way forward. We have to engage ourselves in making it happen. We have to believe in the moral imperative of transformation, and we have to commit ourselves personally and as a society to that imperative. Which brings me back to divine sparks. As we know all too well, the United States has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. Our prison population disproportionately includes poor people and people of color. There are historical reasons for this, including persistent economic inequality, and as Judge Donald and Professor Eberhardt will explore tomorrow, institutional racism. But as we've seen with the passage of the First Step Act, and as is apparent from the diversity of people and organizations represented at this summit, there appears to be broad bipartisan agreement that we incarcerate too many people for too long. By identifying offenders who have a chance of transforming their lives, whether by overcoming self-destructive patterns of behavior or through engaging in restorative process with those they've harmed, by recognizing their inherent worth and connectedness to us and our own connection to them, and by bringing the fullness of our humanity to the slow, steady, daily, granular work of providing concrete support to those who need it, we can meet the steep challenge that we face. This is hard work. And even if we do it thoughtfully and with the openness and humanity it requires, there inevitably will be setbacks and disappointments. But it is work that draws its sustenance from the divine spark in each of us. I commend Aleph for its decades of commitment and for convening such an impressive group of people and organizations. And I commend each of you for being part of this well-conceived and promising symposium. I wish everyone here a productive, informative, and inspiring 2 days. Thanks very much.